The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial uniform one final time. Today marked the annual Royal Marines Tattoo, an event that drew thousands of spectators from around the world to witness the precision and pageantry of Britain's military traditions. James had performed in this ceremony 7 times before, but the butterflies in his stomach reminded him that this year felt different somehow. At 32 years old, James had dedicated nearly half his life to the Royal Marines. His uniform bore the weight of years of service, each medal and insignia telling a story of dedication, sacrifice, and honor. The scarlet tunic, with its pristine white crossbelt and gleaming brass buttons, represented more than just ceremonial dress. It was a symbol of the proud tradition he carried forward from generations of Marines who had worn similar uniforms before him. The preparation area buzzed with controlled energy as dozens of Marines went through their final checks. The sound of boots on concrete mixed with the gentle murmur of last-minute instructions from drill sergeants. James ran his fingers along the white pipework on his uniform, ensuring every detail met the exacting standards expected of a Royal Marine. His rifle felt familiar in his hands, the weight of it as natural as breathing after years of training and ceremony. Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer overseeing the event, moved through the ranks with the practiced eye of a veteran. His presence commanded respect without him needing to say a word. When his gaze fell upon James, there was a subtle nod of recognition. James had earned his place among the elite performers chosen for today's ceremony through years of flawless execution and unwavering dedication to duty. The distant sound of the crowd gathering in the arena filtered through the thick walls of the preparation building. Families, dignitaries, and military enthusiasts had traveled from across the globe to witness this spectacular display of military precision. Among them sat retired Marines who remembered their own days in ceremonial uniform, their eyes bright with memories and pride for the young men and women who now carried the torch. As the final minutes before the ceremony ticked away, James felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Every movement, every step, every gesture would be scrutinized by thousands of eyes. The television cameras would broadcast their performance to millions more around the world. There was no room for error, no second chances in a ceremony of this magnitude. The quartermaster made his final rounds, checking each Marine's appearance with the thoroughness of a master craftsman inspecting his work. When he reached James, his experienced hand smoothed an invisible wrinkle and adjusted a brass button that was already perfectly aligned. It was a ritual as old as military ceremony itself, the passing of standards from one generation to the next through attention to the smallest details. James closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself as he had learned to do before every important mission. The noise around him faded into background silence as he focused on the task ahead. In his mind, he walked through every step of the ceremony, every movement choreographed to perfection through countless hours of practice. His breathing steadied, his heartbeat slowed, and the nervous energy transformed into focused determination. When he opened his eyes, his fellow Marines were taking their positions for the march to the arena. The moment had arrived. Years of training, months of preparation, and hours of final rehearsal had led to this single point in time. James took his place in formation, his spine straight, his chin up, his eyes forward. The heavy doors of the preparation area began to swing open, revealing the path that would lead them into the arena and into the spotlight of one of Britain's most cherished military traditions. The first notes of the military band drifted through the opening doors, and James felt his pulse quicken with anticipation. Soon, he and his fellow Marines would march onto that hallowed ground, carrying with them the weight of history and the expectations of a nation. Little did he know that within minutes, an unexpected incident would transform this routine ceremony into something that would be remembered and talked about for years to come, creating a story that would exemplify the very best of military tradition and human character. The arena erupted in applause as the Royal Marines marched onto the field in perfect formation. Their synchronized steps created a rhythmic thunder that resonated through the packed stadium, while the military band's stirring melody filled the evening air. James felt the familiar surge of pride as he moved with his unit, each Marine a single part of a magnificent whole that had been practiced to mechanical precision. Spectators filled every seat in the massive arena, their faces illuminated by the powerful floodlights that bathed the field in brilliant white light. Children pointed excitedly at the colorful uniforms, while veterans in the audience straightened their shoulders with remembered pride. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Everyone present understanding they were witnessing something truly special. As the Marines reached their designated positions, James executed the first of many complex maneuvers they would perform throughout the evening. The ceremony had been planned down to the second, with each movement flowing seamlessly into the next. The months of rehearsal showed in every synchronized turn, every perfectly timed rifle movement, every step that landed in unison with dozens of others. The television cameras captured every angle of the performance, their operators skilled in showcasing the pageantry that made the Royal Marines tattoo famous worldwide. Commentary was unnecessary as the visual spectacle spoke for itself, the discipline and dedication of the Marines evident in every movement. James could feel the weight of those cameras, knowing that his family back home was likely watching, filled with the same pride that had sustained him through years of service. 20 minutes into the ceremony, the Marines began their most challenging sequence, a complex drill that required absolute precision and timing. James moved through the familiar motions, his body operating on the muscle memory built through countless hours of practice. His rifle spun through the air in a carefully choreographed arc, the polished metal catching the stadium lights as it rotated. It was during the execution of a particularly demanding maneuver that disaster struck with devastating swiftness. As James brought his rifle down in a sharp movement, the edge of the bayonet caught the white crossbelt of his ceremonial uniform. The sound that followed was barely audible to the crowd, but to James it might as well have been thunder. The distinctive rip of fabric tearing sent a chill down his spine as he felt his uniform give way. The crossbelt, stretched beyond its limits by the unexpected contact with the bayonet, split along its entire length. The white leather separated with a sound that seemed to echo in James's ears, despite the music and crowd noise surrounding him. Instantly, he felt the loosened uniform shift against his body, the carefully fitted tunic no longer maintaining its pristine appearance. For a split second that felt like an eternity, James's mind raced through his options. The ceremony continued around him, his fellow Marines maintaining their positions and executing their movements with clockwork precision. The crowd remained unaware of the crisis unfolding before their eyes, but James knew that within moments, his damaged uniform would become obvious to everyone in the arena. The torn crossbelt hung awkwardly against his scarlet tunic, creating an unmistakable disruption in the otherwise perfect symmetry of the formation. James could feel the weight of his loosened uniform affecting his posture, threatening to compromise not only his own performance but potentially disrupting the entire carefully orchestrated display. His training kicked in immediately, the years of discipline and preparation providing him with the mental framework to handle this unprecedented situation. The first rule of military ceremony had been drilled into him from his earliest days of service: maintain composure regardless of circumstances. Panic was not an option, not with thousands watching and his fellow Marines depending on the integrity of their formation. As the seconds ticked by, James made rapid calculations about his next move. The ceremony had specific protocols for dealing with equipment failures, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this exact scenario. He was trapped between the need to maintain military bearing and the growing awareness that his uniform was becoming more obviously damaged with each movement. The music swelled around him as the formation prepared for their next sequence, and James knew he was rapidly approaching a moment of decision. The torn crossbelt swayed with each step, creating a visual distraction that threatened to draw attention away from the collective perfection the Marines had worked so hard to achieve. Whatever he chose to do next would define not only his own performance but potentially the entire ceremony's success or failure. In that critical moment, James made a decision that would demonstrate the true character of a Royal Marine. Rather than allow his damaged uniform to compromise the ceremony, he chose to continue performing with even greater precision and focus. His movements became more deliberate, his bearing more upright, as if sheer force of will could overcome the physical limitations of his torn crossbelt. The crowd remained oblivious to the drama playing out before them, but James's fellow Marines began to notice the disruption. The Marine to his left, Corporal Davies, caught sight of the torn leather during a synchronized turn. His eyes widened slightly, but his training held firm. Without breaking formation or missing a beat, Davy subtly adjusted his position to help shield James from the most prominent camera angles. Word spread silently through the formation, using the subtle communication methods that only military personnel could recognize. A slight shift in posture here, a barely perceptible nod there, and soon an entire section of the ceremonial guard had reorganized themselves to provide cover for their compromised colleague. It was military brotherhood in action, the kind of unspoken loyalty that defines elite units around the world. Sergeant Major Thompson, observing from the sidelines, noticed the subtle changes in the formation immediately. His experienced eye caught what the civilian audience could not see, the nearly invisible adjustments that indicated something was amiss. Through his binoculars, he spotted James's damaged uniform and felt a surge of concern for how this would affect the ceremony's outcome. But as Thompson continued to watch, his concern transformed into admiration. Rather than allowing the equipment failure to demoralize him, James was performing with enhanced intensity. His rifle work became more crisp, his timing more precise, as if the accident had focused his attention to an even sharper point. The torn crossbelt became almost irrelevant compared to the excellence of his execution. The television cameras continued their coverage, but the professional camera operators began to unconsciously favor angles that showcased the formation's strengths, rather than highlighting any individual imperfections. It was as if the entire production crew sensed the importance of preserving the ceremony's dignity without being explicitly told to do so. As the ceremony progressed into its second half, James's challenge intensified. The weight of his loosened uniform continued to affect his balance, requiring constant micro-adjustments to maintain his military bearing. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air, the combination of physical exertion and mental stress pushing his endurance to its limits. Colonel Harrison, watching from the VIP section, received a discreet report about the situation from Sergeant Major Thompson. Rather than immediately ordering James to withdraw from the ceremony, Harrison chose to observe how the situation would develop. He recognized that sometimes the most profound moments in military tradition arise not from perfection, but from how individuals respond to unexpected challenges. The audience, meanwhile, was experiencing what many would later describe as one of the most moving Royal Marines tattoo ceremonies they had ever witnessed. The precision was flawless, the music stirring, and there was an intangible quality to the performance that seemed to elevate it beyond mere military display. They were witnessing dedication in its purest form, though they didn't yet understand the full story behind what they were seeing. James's family, watching from home on television, noticed that he seemed to be performing with exceptional focus and intensity. His mother commented to her husband that James looked more determined than she had ever seen him, as if something important was at stake beyond the normal pressures of the ceremony. They had no way of knowing how accurate her observation truly was. As the ceremony entered its final phase, James faced his greatest test yet. The closing sequence required the most complex movements of the entire evening, including several maneuvers that would place maximum stress on his damaged uniform. The torn crossbelt had continued to deteriorate throughout the performance, and James knew that one wrong movement could result in a complete uniform failure that would be impossible to hide from the cameras and crowd. The band struck up the final ceremonial march, and James steeled himself for the most challenging minutes of his military career. Every step now carried the weight of not just his own reputation, but the honor of his unit and the integrity of a tradition that stretched back generations. The torn crossbelt was no longer just a uniform malfunction. It had become a test of character that would define him as a Marine and as a man. The final sequence of the ceremony demanded movements that would push James's damaged uniform to its absolute breaking point. As the Marines began their closing drill, James felt the torn crossbelt shifting with each step, threatening to give way entirely. The weight of his loosened tunic pulled at his shoulders, creating an uncomfortable drag that required constant compensation to maintain his posture. During a particularly complex maneuver involving a synchronized rifle spin, James felt the remaining threads of his crossbelt beginning to separate. The leather had been stretched beyond its limits, and only a few strands of material were keeping his ceremonial uniform together. With thousands of eyes upon him and cameras broadcasting to millions worldwide, complete uniform failure seemed inevitable. But James had underestimated the power of military brotherhood. As the formation moved through its intricate patterns, his fellow Marines had created an almost imperceptible protective formation around him. Corporal Davies maintained his position to James's left, while Lance Corporal Williams had subtly adjusted his spacing to provide additional cover from the right. Behind him, Marine Foster had shortened his step length by mere inches, ensuring that any uniform debris would be caught before it could scatter across the parade ground. The crowd sensed something special was happening, though they couldn't identify exactly what it was. There was an electricity in the air, a feeling that they were witnessing something beyond ordinary military pageantry. Veterans in the audience leaned forward in their seats, their experienced eyes detecting the subtle signs of extraordinary discipline and teamwork being displayed before them. Sergeant Major Thompson, monitoring the situation from the sidelines, found himself holding his breath as James approached the ceremony's most demanding moments. The torn cross belt was now clearly visible to anyone looking closely, but somehow James continued to perform with unwavering precision. Thompson had seen many Marines overcome adversity during his career, but rarely had he witnessed such determination in the face of potential public embarrassment. As the ceremony reached its crescendo, James faced his ultimate test. The final drill sequence required each Marine to execute a solo rifle display, while the formation moved around them in a complex pattern. When James's turn arrived, he would be isolated in the center of the arena, fully exposed to every camera and thousands of spectators, with nowhere to hide his damaged uniform. The music built to its dramatic peak as James stepped forward into the spotlight position. The torn crossbelt hung awkwardly against his scarlet tunic, the white leather stark against the red fabric. For a moment, time seemed suspended as the entire arena focused on the lone figure standing at attention in the center of the field. Then something remarkable happened. James began his rifle display with such precision and grace that the crowd forgot to notice his uniform. His movements were fluid poetry in motion, each spin of the rifle executed with mathematical perfection. The bayonet caught the stadium lights as it spun through the air, creating flashes of silver that mesmerized the audience. The television cameras, operated by seasoned professionals who understood the importance of the moment, focused on James's face rather than his damaged uniform. What they captured was the essence of military bearing. A young man transcending physical limitations through sheer force of character and will. His expression showed no hint of the crisis he was managing, only the calm determination of a Marine executing his duty. As James completed his solo display and returned to formation, the crowd erupted in spontaneous applause that continued far longer than protocol normally allowed. The audience hadn't fully understood what they had witnessed, but they recognized excellence when they saw it. The standing ovation that followed was unlike anything the arena had experienced during previous ceremonies. Colonel Harrison, watching from the VIP section, felt a surge of pride that went beyond the normal satisfaction of a well-executed ceremony. He was witnessing the kind of character that defined the finest traditions of military service, the ability to rise above circumstances and find greatness in the face of adversity. The torn crossbelt had become irrelevant compared to the display of integrity and determination he had just observed. Behind the scenes, word of James's performance was spreading through the military community, with the speed that only truly exceptional stories achieve. Senior officers who had initially been concerned about the potential damage to the ceremony's reputation were now discussing how James's response had actually elevated the entire event to something approaching legendary status. The final notes of the ceremonial music echoed through the arena. As the Marines completed their closing formation, James stood at attention with his unit, his damaged uniform still visible to those who looked closely, but his bearing remained perfect. He had not merely survived his crisis, he had transformed it into a demonstration of the values that make military service a calling, rather than just a profession. As the Royal Marines marched off the field to thunderous applause, James felt the adrenaline that had sustained him throughout the ceremony beginning to ebb. The weight of what he had just accomplished was starting to sink in, but he maintained his military bearing until the formation reached the preparation area and was dismissed. Only then did he allow himself to acknowledge the magnitude of the challenge he had just overcome. The moment the Marines were dismissed, James was surrounded by his fellow servicemen, their faces showing a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Corporal Davies was the first to speak. his voice filled with genuine respect. "Mate, I've never seen anything like that in 15 years of service. You turned a disaster into something beautiful." The other Marines nodded in agreement, their appreciation evident in their expressions. Word of James's performance spread through the backstage area with remarkable speed. Senior officers who had been monitoring the situation approached to offer their congratulations, while younger Marines looked at him with newfound respect. The story was already taking on mythic proportions as each telling emphasized different aspects of his remarkable composure under pressure. Sergeant Major Thompson appeared at James's shoulder, his weathered face showing rare emotion. "In 30 years of military service, I've seen plenty of Marines handle equipment failures," he said quietly. "But I've never seen anyone turn a uniform malfunction into a masterclass of military bearing. You didn't just maintain standards tonight, son. You redefined them." Colonel Harrison arrived moments later, having made his way through the crowds of well-wishers and military personnel who wanted to meet the Marine who had captured everyone's attention. His approach caused the gathered crowd to step back respectfully, creating a small circle of privacy around James and his commanding officer. "Sergeant Mitchell," the colonel began, his formal tone carrying undertones of genuine warmth. "I've been in command of this unit for 8 years, and I've overseen dozens of ceremonial events. Tonight you demonstrated something that can't be taught in training manuals or learned through drill practice. You showed us what it truly means to be a Royal Marine." The colonel's words carried special weight because everyone present knew his reputation for maintaining the highest standards. His praise was never given lightly, and hearing him speak with such obvious admiration made James's accomplishment feel even more significant to those who had witnessed it firsthand. As James finally had a moment to examine his damaged uniform properly, he discovered that the crossbelt had been held together by little more than willpower during the final portions of the ceremony. The leather had separated completely in several places, and only the careful positioning of his fellow Marines had prevented a complete uniform failure that would have been visible to the entire audience. The quartermaster who had inspected James's uniform before the ceremony appeared with a replacement crossbelt, shaking his head in amazement as he examined the damaged original. "I've been fitting Marines for ceremonial dress for 23 years, he said, "and I've never seen a piece of equipment fail so completely without bringing down the entire presentation. The fact that you completed that ceremony is nothing short of miraculous." Media representatives who had covered the ceremony were beginning to ask questions about the Marine whose performance had stood out even among the generally excellent standard of the Royal Marines tattoo. The story was starting to attract attention beyond the immediate military community, with journalists recognizing the human interest potential of James's remarkable display of determination. Television producers were already reviewing footage of the ceremony, looking for the best angles to showcase James's performance in their post-event coverage. The cameras had captured not just his movements, but the subtle ways his fellow Marines had supported him throughout his crisis. The story was becoming bigger than just one Marine's individual achievement. It was becoming a testament to military teamwork and brotherhood. James's family, still unaware of the specific challenges he had faced, called to congratulate him on what they described as his most impressive performance ever. His mother mentioned again how focused and determined he had appeared on television, noting that something about his bearing had seemed different from previous ceremonies they had watched. As the evening wound down and the arena began to empty, James found himself reflecting on how the night's events would change his perspective on military service. The torn crossbelt had initially seemed like a career-threatening disaster, but it had ultimately become an opportunity to demonstrate the values he had spent years developing through his training and service. The other Marines began changing out of their ceremonial uniforms, but James hesitated before removing his damaged tunic. The torn crossbelt had become more than just a piece of equipment. It was now a symbol of one of the most defining moments of his military career. He knew that years from now, when he looked back on his time as a Royal Marine, this would be the night that stood out above all others. The weeks following the Royal Marines tattoo brought unexpected changes to James's life that he could never have anticipated. The story of his performance with the damaged uniform had spread far beyond the immediate military community, capturing the imagination of people around the world who were moved by his demonstration of professionalism under pressure. Television networks began featuring the story in their human interest segments, using footage from the ceremony to illustrate what they described as a perfect example of military excellence. The video of James's solo rifle display, performed while his uniform was literally falling apart, became an internet sensation that was shared millions of times across social media platforms. Military academies incorporated James's story into their leadership training programs, using it as a case study in maintaining composure during unexpected crises. Instructors found that the story resonated particularly well with young cadets, who could relate to the fear of public embarrassment, while admiring the way James had transformed potential disaster into triumph. The Royal Marines Museum requested James's damaged uniform for a special exhibition about military tradition and excellence under pressure. The torn crossbelt, which had once threatened to end his ceremonial career, became a symbol of perseverance that inspired thousands of visitors who came to see the display. James received letters from around the world, including messages from veterans who shared their own stories of overcoming equipment failures and unexpected challenges during military service. Children wrote to tell him how his story had inspired them to persevere through difficulties in school and sports, while their parents thanked him for providing such a positive role model. The most meaningful recognition came from within his own unit, where James's performance had elevated the reputation of the entire ceremonial guard. Fellow Marines who had served with him for years spoke with new respect about his character, and younger servicemen sought him out for advice and mentorship. The brotherhood that had supported him during his crisis had grown stronger as a result of their shared experience. Colonel Harrison formally recognized James's performance in the unit's official records, noting that his actions had brought honor not just to himself, but to the Royal Marines as an institution. The citation emphasized how James had demonstrated the core values of military service in the most visible possible circumstances, under pressure that would have broken lesser individuals. 6 months after the ceremony, James was selected to serve as an instructor at the Royal Marines Training Facility, where he would help prepare the next generation of Marines for both the technical and character challenges of military service. His new role would allow him to share not just the tactical skills he had developed, but the mental toughness and integrity that had carried him through his moment of crisis. The damaged crossbelt found a permanent home in James's personal collection, displayed in his quarters as a reminder of the night that defined his understanding of what it meant to be a Marine. Visitors who saw it were always curious about its significance, giving James opportunities to reflect on how unexpected challenges often reveal our true character. Years later, when James had risen to senior rank and was preparing for retirement, he would often tell young Marines about the night his uniform was torn. The story became part of his legacy, passed down through generations of servicemen who understood that true military bearing isn't about having perfect equipment or ideal conditions, but about maintaining excellence regardless of circumstances. The Royal Marines tattoo ceremony where James's uniform failed became known as one of the most memorable in the event's history, not despite the equipment failure, but because of how it was handled. The incident that could have been a source of embarrassment instead became a source of pride that enhanced the reputation of the entire organization. James eventually married and started a family, and his children grew up hearing the story of their father's famous performance. They learned from his example that character is revealed not in moments of comfort and success, but in times of difficulty and pressure. The values he had demonstrated that night became part of their family identity. On quiet evenings, James would sometimes take out the torn crossbelt and remember the weight of that moment when everything seemed to be falling apart. But he would also remember the support of his fellow Marines, the trust of his commanding officers, and the strength he had found within himself when it mattered most. The torn uniform had become the foundation of a story about human resilience that would inspire others long after he had left active service. The legacy of that single night proved that sometimes our greatest achievements come not from perfect conditions, but from our response to imperfect ones. James's torn crossbelt had become a symbol that excellence isn't about avoiding challenges, but about rising above them with dignity, determination, and grace.